Hi there, I'm Wendy McCallum, Burnout Balance Coach and Wellness Expert, and you're listening to Bite Size Balance, where everyday extraordinary women share their stories, expertise, and wisdom, all in the name of lifting each other up and creating a better life by design. Whether it's wellness, career, relationships, food, mindfulness, hormones, or parenting, we talk about all things women's balance. If your life looks great on paper, but it still feels like something's missing, you're in the right place. Welcome to Bite Size Balance. Hello, everybody. I am back with Sarah Baillie. Hi, Sarah. It's been such a long time. Again, we took our 15-minute menopause break to go have a pee, make a cup of decaf coffee for me and tea for Sarah, I think. And we're back now. What we want to talk about today is really connected to the last podcast episode. So if you haven't listened to the last episode that Sarah and I did together, in that episode, we talked about women's burnout and adrenal fatigue in women and what that looks like. And this episode is really kind of the second step in that we're going to talk again a little bit about stress, the stress response in women's bodies and the hormone cortisol. But we're also going to really try to focus in today on the good news when it comes to stress, in terms of, all of the things that are actually available to us as women that we can be using regularly, just some strategies, some tactics, some tools that can actually help us to manage stress, reduce our cortisol over, the course of our lifetimes, and hopefully prevent us from either getting to burnout, or if we've already been burnt out, getting back into burnout. Mm-hmm. So hello, Sarah, welcome back.
Thank you.
So we were talking, as we always do before this episode started recording, we were talking about how we wanted to make sure that the first thing we did was stress a couple of things. The first thing we want to make sure everybody understands is that stress is not in itself a bad thing. So stress is something that it's part of life. Stress is all around us. If we didn't have stress, it's in fact a positive force most of the time. So stress is the thing that, get stuff done. Like if we didn't have deadlines and requirements and obligations and responsibilities, we would not be very productive as humans. So stress is, it's not all bad. We want to start off saying that. And it's actually a necessary positive force. The trick with stress, as with everything, is about balance. So it's about how much stress is there in your life, and is the stress that's in your life necessary stress? Or is a lot of the stuff that's going on unnecessary, things that you could be managing or controlling differently, which is what we want to focus on today. We're not going to focus on the stuff in your life that you can't control. Those big things that are going on right now that feel totally overwhelming to you, like maybe the pandemic, but it might also be more specific, to you and your life circumstances. Maybe you're grieving the loss of someone, you're going through a divorce, you're changing your job, your kids have just flown the nest. All of those things are stressors that we have to deal with as women. And what I want to make sure we're really making clear up front is that you're capable of dealing with that. That's okay. That stuff, we're designed to deal with that stuff. All of that stuff is okay. We're going to focus instead today on some of the stuff that is within your control and what you can do around that. The other thing that Sarah wanted to talk about, and I'll let you take this one, Sarah, is that cortisol is not a bad thing. So do you want to talk about that?
So we kind of demonize cortisol. So we talk about it as high cortisol being negative, but then that sort of the way we talk tends to translate as if all cortisol is negative. And I just want to be clear that cortisol is absolutely necessary for life. It's part of maintaining homeostasis. That's a word I've used before, which is basically biological balance. And you need cortisol for example, you need cortisol first thing in the morning to put some stored sugar into your bloodstream so that you can actually get out of bed and get to breakfast. It's called cortisol awakening response, and it wakes you up in the morning. And you need cortisol. Oh my gosh, I just had a total menopausal moment. Oh, it manages inflammation. So those are two areas where if we have normal, healthy levels of cortisol, then that helps us to stay alive. It's when the cortisol response gets out of control, and again, like outside of that homeostatic balance, so it becomes high and unmanageable, that's when it's causing problems. So I just wanted to make sure that we're not completely demonizing cortisol, and we're not saying we have to get rid of all of our cortisol, right?
Yeah.
We need to bring it, again, like everything else, we need to bring it into balance.
Yeah, I always use this analogy, Sarah. I forgot to share this with you before. So if you think I'm way off track, let me know, please. But when I'm coaching around with stress and burnout and cortisol, I always use this analogy of a cortisol cup. So I always get people to imagine that they have like a cup in their body that's designed to hold cortisol, because the truth is we do have a capacity for cortisol. It's an essential hormone, like you just said. And so we need it. So if you imagine that you have kind of a vessel in your body that's designed to hold cortisol, and the cortisol is going in there when it's created, which is clearly not what's actually happening, but just go with me on this. If it's going into this cup, as long as that cup doesn't overflow, you're going to be okay. But when the cup starts to trickle over and there's too much cortisol going on in your body, that's when you start to, you're at a higher risk of developing some of these symptoms of high cortisol that we're going to talk about in a second. So when I'm talking to my female clients about preventing burnout and just managing stress over the course of their lifetimes, I'm always saying, like, put cortisol like right up there with how many fruits and veggies you eat. Like, start thinking about it as something that you need to proactively manage in order to be well and healthy for the rest of your life. Don't just pay lip service to stress management. Actually do something about it. Actually start to proactively, strategically incorporate it as part of your own balance and how you live your life. Anyway, I don't know, but whether that analogy flies.
That's a great analogy.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, it's all about balance.
Okay, perfect. So the first thing I think we wanted to really kind of explain, and we did touch on this in the last podcast, but we're going to go over it again. Where we want to talk about the stress cycle, and we want to talk about the full stress cycle. Last time we talked a lot about the first part of the stress cycle, which is the fight or flight response. We also want to talk about the second part of the stress cycle, what sort of naturally is meant to happen once the stressor has passed for us as women. And I think we really want to make it kind of clarify the difference between how we're designed to behave and what stress is sort of meant to look like for us. As you know, I always say this too, we have to remember that we are animals. We're at the top of the food chain. We're kind of fancy animals, but we're still animals. And so our stress response is designed to work in a very similar way as all the other mammals out there and their stress response. And I think it's important to look into nature for some guidance around what's supposed to be happening here, because as fancy animals, our lives and our stressors don't look anything like the stressors that other animals are dealing with out there. And that's really important. So maybe are you okay if I start, Sarah, and kind of explain that stress cycle, and then you can pipe in if I miss anything?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. All right. So the way I always explain the stress cycle is that when we, as animals, when we we find ourselves in the presence of something that's threatening or stressful, we automatically go into what is called the fight or flight response. And it is literally automatic. We have no control over it. It's a self-defense mechanism. It's our bodies taking care of us. And what happens in fight or flight is that our stress hormones start to surge, cortisol and adrenaline. Cortisol is the one we're going to focus on for the purposes of this conversation. But those hormones, when they ramp up, basically set in motion like what I consider to be sort of a set of dominoes in terms of the symptoms. So there's a domino that falls first when your cortisol rises. Your breathing pattern starts to change. So you go from kind of a relaxed, deeper pattern of breath into a more shallow, rapid pattern of breath. You can't always feel that. In fact, most of the time you can't feel that probably. Now, if you've had a panic attack or, and you've seen somebody go into that like really heightened change in breath, then you know what I'm talking about. But this is just like, it's happening underneath everything in our bodies when we find ourselves in a stressful situation. So the first domino that changes is your breathing pattern. And because you're breathing differently, that causes your heart rate to go up and your blood pressure to elevate. And that, of course, changes the way your body is kind of oxygenating itself and your tissues, your muscles contract, your eyesight sharpens. All of this stuff is happening to amp you up and physically prepare you to deal with the stressful thing. And what your brain is going to do is it's going to make a choice. It's going to choose between fight or flight. It's going to make a decision. What am I going to do here? Am I going to fight? Am I going to flee? And of course, all of that stuff that's happening in your body is designed to put you in a position to deal with that as best you can. At the same time as that is happening, and Sarah, you can speak to this a little more, The systems in your body that are perceived to be kind of non-essential or unimportant when it comes to dealing with stress, those get compromised or shut down. I always talk about digestion as the system, and I kind of focus on that because I talk to people. I talk a lot about food with people, and so I focus on digestion as one system that shuts down. But I remember when we were talking about hormones, you talked about how the reproductive system also gets shut down, and I think that's really interesting. You want to talk about that for a sec?
Right. So if you think about the fight or flight response as designed for as your short-term survival, so the body is actually redirecting energy from the long-term survival to short-term survival in order to get you up that tree or have you fight the lion or whatever it is that you have to do. During that time, the body thinks you just might die in the next 30 seconds. So it's not putting any energy into long-term survival functions. So those would, as you say, include digestion and absorption. So if you're eating a bagel on the run, and swallowing it after you're only chewing a couple of times, and that big bagel is sitting in your stomach and you're rushing from meeting to meeting and not really thinking about digestion, that the body is not dealing with that bagel, right? So your digestion is compromised. That can show up as symptoms like IBS or heartburn. But the other systems that are compromised are hormone production. So the body doesn't care if you or your species ever reproduce again if you're not going to live past the next 30 seconds, right?
Right.
So it's not putting energy into reproductive hormones. And in fact, in the case of progesterone, it's sort of stealing hormones in order to make cortisol. But it's really like you'll see it in animal groups where if they're as a group experiencing a stressor like drought, their reproduction levels will drop significantly, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of a biological safety net where the body's not putting any energy into looking after your reproduction or your species reproduction. And I would argue that part of our challenges in increasing challenges in fertility in women is also partially part of that, right?
Yeah.
It's because highly stressed individuals, especially sort of not 18-year-olds, but highly stressed individuals who are a little bit older are going to have a harder time getting pregnant.
Yeah.
That's a whole other topic, but the other systems that are important are sort of repair. So repair of any of the injuries that happen to your body during the day. We make a ton of free radicals every single day, just in the normal function of our day-to-day lives. And we need the body to be able to clean those up or they cause cellular damage. And so if the body's thinking you're going to die in the next 30 seconds, it's not looking at sweeping up that mess, right? It's not cleaning up. And then if you're not sleeping well, on top of all the stressors, you're not getting that restorative sleep, which allows the body to do its cleanup work at night. So it's not repairing the damage. So it's leaving you more vulnerable to long-term chronic disease. And then it's also not able to fight infection well, because it's also like, the next 30 seconds or fighting a potential infection. It doesn't really it can't really distinguish between it can distinguish between those things, which is right now we're in high level stress. That's all that matters. So if we do this, it doesn't seem significant if we only have one stressor in a day, right? But if we're doing this 50, 60, 70, 80 times a day, having these little stressors, then your long-term survival is compromised.
Yeah, exactly. And so when we're talking about the long-term impacts of stress, or as we were talking about it in the last episode, burnout or adrenal fatigue, we're talking about like what ends up happening physiologically in our bodies when we just like run ourselves ragged effectively. We're talking about both the effects of elevated cortisol for too long, and we're also talking about the effects of having these other systems compromised for too long, the ones that actually are important when it comes to keeping us healthy. So that's important, I think, for people to understand. Now, if we go back to the fight or flight that I was talking about, and this idea of getting yourself ramped up to deal with the stressor, if you go back to kind of the other mammals out there, we just remind ourselves again that we're animals, and we think about, for example, like a rabbit. A rabbit is dealing with stressors like, am I going to get killed or kill this thing? Am I going to eat today or not? Am I going to get across the road, or am I going to get hit by the car? And all of those stressors are really short-term acute things. Like, they're over as fast as they start. And that honestly is what we're designed to deal with as humans. Short-term acute stressors that resolve themselves quickly, because when the stressful situation resolves itself, we move into the second step, the second stage of the stress cycle, which is called the parasympathetic phase, or the relaxation response is how I always refer to it. And that is also kind of automatic. Like, we move into that when the physical stressor has passed and there's a cue or signal to our body that it's over. And when we move into the relaxation response, what happens effectively is all of those dominoes reverse. They go back the other way. And so our heart rate and our blood pressure come down, and our muscles relax, and our eyesight goes back to normal, and our breathing returns to a deeper, slower breathing pattern. And those systems that have been compromised get turned back on. And we kind of return to kind of that homeostasis, that balance place that you're talking about. And that's what's supposed to happen. The problem is it doesn't happen a lot of the time for us for a couple of reasons. The first is we're not dealing with short-term acute stressors, a lot of us. Like, we deal with those too, but a lot of the stress that the women that I work with in my practice are dealing with is more like kind of chronic, I always call it umbrella stress, like where you're just walking around and it's following you all day long. You're always anxious. You're always worried. You never really feel like you can get everything done that needs to get done. So you're kind of in this state of chronically elevated cortisol. So you're always in kind of fight or flight. And then if we're talking about the acute short-term stressors, the ones that do kind of resolve more quickly. In my practice, what I see is, for example, if I have somebody who works in the emergency room department or a teacher in a school, they might say, yeah, I do have short-term stressors, and that, crises happen and then I manage them. And then for a very short period of time, it feels like everything's okay, but then the next one happens. And so it's just a series of these short-term stressors all day. Women who are home with young children feel this way when I talk to them. Like, it's just one thing after another. Somebody's losing their temper about something and they manage that crisis, and then someone else needs their diaper changed, and then somebody dumps a bottle of apple juice all over the floor, and then the dog brings a dead bird in. That used to happen to me when I had babies. My dog used to bring me presents, dead bird presents, which would jack my cortisol. I don't know why I just thought of that example, but if I go back to my time when I had 2 toddlers in the home, like, it was constant crisis, one after another. And so in that situation, what's happening is your cortisol is going up, and it might come down just for a really short period of time, but it's right back up again. So in either of those scenarios, we're very unlike the rabbit. So, our cortisol is going up and it's staying up. It's just up for far too long. And that's really what we wanted to talk about today. I think we want to talk about the dangers of that, but we also wanted to give you some really, so hopefully helpful, accessible ideas for how you can manage that. And some of it relates to actually reducing the stress, which I'll talk about later. So there are always stressors in your life that are jacking your cortisol up, putting cortisol in that cup I was talking about that maybe don't need to be putting cortisol in the cup. But there are also, as I said, stressors that are putting cortisol in the cup that you can't control, and that's okay too. So there are ways to reduce the cortisol that goes in your cup, but there are also ways to trick your body into thinking that the stressor has passed when it's still there. And there's a lot of power in that too. Okay, so why don't you talk about closing the stress loop? So why don't you give some of your kind of favorite strategies or ways for people to actually kind of push themselves into that relaxation response, into that second stage of the stress cycle, which is how we bring our cortisol back down. What are some of your favorite strategies that you talk to your patients about?
Okay, can I just go back 1 second? Because something just occurred to me.
Yes.
That another thing that really resonates with my patients when we're talking about this high cortisol state is that it brings with it a level of hypervigilance, which then means that the nervous system is primed to react to anything as a stressor. Anything becomes a predator. Whereas when you're saying that we can identify things that we're perceiving as predators that don't necessarily need to be predators, the perception of things like getting your groceries done, for example, as a predator, that comes from that primed nervous system, and that you can bring that with you from childhood. So if you grew up in a family where there was uncertainty around your safety, and that can come from lots of different causes, or uncertainty in your safety around people's emotional reactions. I mean, it's just multitask. If you were a kid who was walking on eggshells in any way, then your nervous system starts out primed. And so your whole life can be in this state of reactivity. So I just wanted to mention that it's kind of like it can be a lifelong tool that you learned for survival that now doesn't necessarily need to be used for survival.
That's a really good point. When I think about my own experience in that, I think that's how I went through. I had a real difficulty readjusting after I stopped practicing law, because I was in that, like, I was definitely in fight or flight for like 12 years when I was doing that, because I don't know if I've shared this on the podcast, but I worked for 7 years as a lawyer in a busy firm. And then what happened was I was also going through significant stress at the time around trying to have a family. And I'd had a couple of pregnancy losses. And then we decided to adopt, which was in itself was a stressful process. We adopted a baby boy on November 11th, 2003, which was incredibly exciting. But also, again, there's such a thing as positive stress, right? So stress isn't always negative either. Like, stress can be something that's really good and it's a really positive thing, but still create that stress response in your body. And definitely having a baby is one of those things. It's stressful. It's exciting, but it's also stressful. So we adopted my son, and I happened to be 9 weeks pregnant at the time. And so I had another baby 7 months later. So I had 2 babies within 7 months. And right in between those 2 babies, I got asked to be a partner at the law firm. And at the time wasn't really any other option than to say yes. So I had a baby, made partner, had another baby, and continued to practice as a partner for 5 years with these 2 babies, and totally burnt myself out and was in that elevated fight or flight state. And then I made this really great decision to leave that and move back to Nova Scotia. But all of a sudden I had nothing to do. And I was exactly that person you're talking about. So I'm glad you raised that, where it was like everything was a crisis because I didn't know how it couldn't be a crisis. And everything, I was stressed about the fact that I didn't have anything to stress about. Like, I made things up to be stressed about because I just don't think that my brain knew what to do with this new situation that I was in. And I really had to train myself. And I've worked hard over the last however many years it's been now, 12, 15 years. I've worked really hard to build some of these practices that we're going to talk about into my own life, to kind of bring myself down from that place where I was for so many years. So I appreciate you raising that. Is that what you were talking about? My little explanation, is that kind of what you're talking about? Yeah, it really resonates with me, and I'm sure it'll resonate with other women out there. It's really easy to find yourself in that place and then just take that with you as you go forward. And, probably when I think back, that probably comes from I was always like that as a kid. I was always like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, the bottom line for me is that obviously there are stressors you can't control, but of the myriad things in our lives, of the daily lists and things that you accomplish in the day, you can actually choose how you approach it. And that sounds trite, but it's true. I mean, basically, like, you can run it through the stress, you can run it through the fight or flight pathway if you want. And if you're already primed for that, it's going to go there. But you can actually make a choice not to run it through that pathway.
Yes.
And so when you're, choosing about whether or not I'm going to get stressed out because I don't have time to pick up my Blundstones at the, that's today, I've got to pick up my Blundstones at the shoe place before they close for the weekend. I can turn that into a major crisis. What will I wear on my feet? Right? I could actually make that into something where I can feel my heart rate
Yeah. Yeah.
rising,
Yeah.
right? Or I can just say, well, I guess I'll get them next week.
Yeah.
You
And
know, there's kind of,
yeah. 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 Well, that
so
cortisol.
it's choice.
Yeah, that cortisol cup analogy that I was using, the next step in it is really exactly what you and I are talking about now, which we've kind of skipped ahead, but this is how we roll. We tend to just go all over the place in these podcasts. But what I talk about in that with that cortisol cup is like, if you imagine like those big life stressors that you can't control, you know, your job and like the fact that you've got a really sick parent and, you know, it's a pandemic, that stuff is putting cortisol into that cup. And that's okay. But what you need to remember is all the power that you have in all of this little stuff. And this is where the second fridge magnet comes in. So the first fridge magnet we haven't talked about yet because we're doing this out of order. But the second fridge magnet that I talk about with my clients is don't sweat the small stuff, which is something that you see that all over the place, but nobody really knows exactly what that means or why it matters. This is why it matters, because if you have, 40, 50, 60 of those little things happening, the little stuff happening in your week that is also causing your cortisol to rise. It may not be creating as much cortisol for as long, but it's all of those little bits of cortisol, when you put them together cumulatively, can be the difference between your cup overflowing or not.
Yeah.
Right. Like this is the stuff that is within your control, all of this little stuff. Now you're right. Like some of us are kind of naturally going to go into fight or flight sooner because of a myriad of circumstances and maybe our past experience. But take it from me, a reformed stress magnet, and I think you might identify with this too, like somebody who, I'm a type A person and I really did like just take it up whenever I could take it up. I took it up like 10 notches. But as somebody who recognized that was not healthy and that I needed to really start trying to make some changes, and I started getting super mindful and aware around it, and it takes time. And in the beginning, it's really hard and you don't do it very well. But the more you do this and the more you remind yourself of the fact that you don't need to sweat the small stuff, and that not only is it sapping you of your joy because you're constantly cranky and stressed out and anxious, it's also potentially physically affecting you, like affecting your physical health, right? And that can be really motivating. And I also talk about cortisol jackers in terms of people, because, it's not just these little events, like, because you can all probably, if you're listening to this podcast, you can probably identify like 3 things that like always stress you out. Like you can rely on that thing to stress you out, whether it's traffic or it's lineups or it's, whatever. But you also have cortisol jackers in your life. There are people in your life who jack your cortisol on the regular, and you know who they are too. And those people, once you identify them, you can consciously change the way you respond to them. Like you have some power to change the way you respond. And I always say to people, like, how does it feel to be giving that person some power over your physical health? Like, how does it feel that you're letting that person affect your long-term health? Because, it's easy to justify, they just like, we don't get along. That person, makes me cranky or sad or unhappy or whatever. But when you start thinking about it in the context of your physical health, I think that's really motivating to a lot of women to start really consciously trying to change how they respond and react to people, because those people are putting cortisol in your cup. And it doesn't need to be that way. And that's the part that we want to focus on today. It doesn't need to be that way. There are strategies and things that you can do to change that. My favorite saying, this is not a fridge magnet, I don't think, but it should be, is could I care less? And it's a question that I get my clients like repeating. Some of them have Post-it notes all over their house that says, could I care less? Because the truth is, you can almost always care less. And that, the next question is like, what happens if I do? Like, what would happen if I cared less? I think you and I were just talking about this before the podcast. You had like a weekend where you had this thought of, why don't you explain that? Because I think it goes right along.
Oh, yeah. So I don't know. I don't know what the circumstances were that made me do this, but I think I was just having a long period of stress, and I just looked around one day and thought, what if I did nothing on the weekend? I mean, really, what does that actually look like? I was brought up a list maker, and I have a list for every person in the house for the weekend. These are all the things that are going to happen. It drives my family crazy. And I thought, basically, fuck it. What if I do nothing? What if I sit on the couch? I've got a really good book on the go. What if I do nothing? How does that feel?
Yeah.
It was very stressful, but I also felt this incredible awareness for the first time. Like, you put way too much weight on just getting shit done. Like, just getting the like little things that in your mind have created, have like risen to a level of importance
Mhm.
that seems really irrelevant if you really start to question yourself about it. And I thought, so for me, the groceries are one of those things. It's just like, yeah, got to do the big shop. The big shop has to happen on the weekend, right? What happens if the big shop doesn't get done? Right? Well, then, the kids won't have anything for lunch. I won't have a plan for the week for suppers. I won't have all of these. And I just thought, what, I'm just not going to do it. I'm just going to see what happens.
Yeah.
And while it was excruciating at the beginning, once I finally leaned into it and was able to say, I'm just going to read my book for the weekend and you people can do whatever you want around me.
Yeah.
It was so liberating. And I thought, what am I getting from being stressed all this time? That's a question I was really interested in answering for myself. And I think it's a really good question for everybody to answer for themselves. Like, what is it that I get from this? I get a sense of control. I get a sense of, it's not purpose so much as just accomplishment. I've checked all these things off the list. Now we can move forward. But what I don't get is a sense of rest, restoration, relaxation, self-care, self-love. I don't get any of that. I just get this like military style, just get shit done because it's the weekend, damn it. We're going to do it.
And everybody hates you.
And everybody hates me.
So there's that.
Yeah.
And
So,
yeah, I hear you.
It just becomes like, and it was really liberating to actually think, can I live my life more like this? And obviously I slipped way, I'm primed to go back to the whole list making military operation. But when on the days where I make conscious choices to say, no, I really prioritizing the fact that I love my book. It changes who I am.
Yeah.
It changes how I manifest, not who I am, but it changes how I manifest in every aspect of my daily life. I have more energy. I feel better. I'm nicer. I'm able to go back to my practice on Monday and not feel so drained.
Yeah, totally. I think my grocery list is wet towels on the floor. And that's the example I always use because for years, every single morning, I would yell at somebody, why is there a wet towel on the floor again?
Right.
And I did it for years and I was like, come and pick up your towel. And then I'd just start threatening stuff. Anyway, everybody hated me because it was, 7:30 in the morning and I was already yelling about stuff. And then finally got to a point where I was like, could I care less? And what would happen if I cared less about the towels? And the truth is, when I worked it through, I was like, nothing bad is going to happen for sure if I care less about the towel. So if I just pick up the towel and hang it up every morning, nothing bad is going to happen. Not only is nothing bad going to happen, nobody's going to hate me. And I'm probably going to have a way better morning. Right. And, the truth is, like, if I continue yelling and I ask myself, like, what's going to happen if I continue yelling? Well, of course, I just keep myself stressed out. But also, my kids are not going to pick up the towels.
Right.
And, like, history has shown me that because for 5 years I've been yelling about the towels and they're still leaving the towels on the floor. So I'm not even, I'm not even accomplishing anything with this. So I think that, it sounds really trite to say, could I care less? But it's actually a really great question. It's very meaningful. The answer can be meaningful. Like, what happens if I care less? Well, if I care less, actually only good stuff happens.
Yeah.
Here in this particular example, right? So we're talking about how, for us as women and humans generally, we often find ourselves in like the first part of fight or flight where our cortisol rises, but then we don't actually move into the relaxation response, which is where we calm down and where our cortisol comes back down. And so we were going to talk about some practical ways to do that. And then we got a little bit off on a tangent and now but it's still related and relevant. We're talking about, how you choose to respond to circumstances and things and people can be the difference between you staying in that elevated cortisol fight or flight state or actually just calming down and moving into the relaxation response. But there are also some really practical steps that you can take, some tools, like some things that you can start using proactively when you find yourself feeling stressed. Because I don't know about you, but I can feel my cortisol rising. Like I can feel, it feels like something physical in my body when I start to get stressed. And when I start feeling my cortisol rising, or when the people listening to the podcast start feeling their cortisol rising, there are things that can be done in that moment. You can almost like train yourself like Pavlov's dog to do something different when you feel your cortisol rising. One of the things that I recommend for all of my clients, and it's the simplest, most accessible, low-hanging fruit when it comes to stress management, is the first fridge magnet, which is just breathe. And what I'd like to do is explain to people why that fridge magnet is actually a really great thing to remember, because most people are, have heard the words just breathe over and over again. They probably had people tell them to breathe. They may have even like gone to a stress clinic, or had a doctor or somebody recommend that they do a specific breathing exercise. But in my experience, in my practice, women don't understand why that works. Like they just don't understand what's happening. So the simplest explanation I have for it is, if you think back to that domino series of symptoms that happens when your cortisol rises and you go into fight or flight, the first domino that sets all the other dominoes in motion is the change in breathing pattern. If you consciously, mindfully decide to breathe differently, so if in the moment when you're in fight or flight, you say to yourself, I'm just going to take 5 deep breaths. I'm just going to pause for a moment. And you take 5 deep, slow belly breaths. What happens is you reverse the first domino. And when you reverse the first domino, all the other dominoes fall. Your blood pressure comes down, your heart rate slows down, your muscles relax, your cortisol comes back down. So for me, breathing is one of the first things that I suggest for women. I just say, look, like this actually does something really specific in your body. It's actually a really helpful tool when it comes to managing stress. Of course, there are different ways to breathe. So there are 1,000 different breathing techniques out there. The easiest one, I think, is like breathe in for 4 counts, pause, breathe out for 4 counts, pause. But you can Google breathing techniques, and I could talk about this for an hour, but it doesn't really matter. As long as you are actually reversing the first domino, you're consciously changing that pattern of breathing, it's going to have that effect for you. It's going to help to relax you and close that stress cycle. And this is why yoga is so awesome. I mean, within the first minute of a yoga class, someone is literally telling you to inhale and exhale. Like they're forcibly changing your breathing pattern. Meditation does the same thing. It's another reason why I love that tool as a way of basically signaling to your body that everything's okay, because you're changing that breathing pattern. What are some of the techniques that you like for closing that stress cycle?
Well, anything that you can do that tells your body that it's safe.
Yeah.
So when you start to breathe, basically your body's saying, oh, well, if she can stop running and she can stand here and breathe, then she must be safe. Then predators must be gone, right? So it's like feeding, it's all, anything that feeds back to the nervous system that there are no more predators is a tool. So that can be varied. For some people, it's breathing. I sometimes ask people who are at desk jobs who are not getting up until lunchtime to set an alarm on their phones for every hour to get up and basically take 5 deep breaths and do the opposite physical movement that they're doing, which is usually like stand up and,
right,
stretch their neck and shoulders. Just that says, oh, I guess the predator must not be here, right? Because if there was still a predator, your body would not let you do that.
Right.
Because it is designed to save your life. So for some people, it's getting up, stretching, and breathing. I mean, breathing, obviously, I think that's the number one. It's free. It's in your body right there. It only takes 5 breaths.
And nobody needs to know you're doing it. You can do it.
All of those things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Another one that I read recently was touching your lips lightly. So just going like this, because there's parasympathetic fibers. So that's the opposite of fight or flight. Parasympathetic fibers in your lips associated with eating, right? So we want the nervous system to slow down.
Right.
when you're eating so that you can digest. So this tells the body, oh, time to digest. We must be in parasympathetic mode. It must be safe. If
Right.
we can stop to eat, if within it's safe. The gazelle who's running away from the lion is not stopping to eat until the lion's gone.
Right.
Right. So it's just another, so, and this is something you can do also is with nobody knowing. It's just touching your lips. Right.
Right.
I thought that was just one I learned recently. Anytime in nature. So nature has incredible healing abilities, and anything that and what I would call sort of, I know that is it Nikosi? The
Yeah, Nagoski.
Nagoski sisters talk about exercise as a way to complete the stress cycle.
Mhm.
So exercise, joyful movement is important, something that brings you joy, something you like doing, if that's hiking in nature, if it is even going for a walk around the block, if you're working in an office building, just being sort of away from the stressors.
Yeah.
But so exercise that makes you feel joyful and alive. But if you are adrenally stressed or tired, it's important not to push that exercise to the point where you're exhausted.
Yeah.
So that's where you cross the line into draining your resources.
Yeah.
But as far as like in the moment, we're looking for, I mean, you had that great quote about wasting time, which it's really important, because I encourage people to look for things in their lives that take their time away, that where they lose time. So if that's, for me, it's reading a novel. For someone else, it might be singing or dancing in their kitchen. It may be raking leaves. It doesn't matter. Whatever it is, where your body is feeding back to your adrenal glands that it's safe.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then those are all mechanisms that put you immediately into fight or flight, out of fight or flight.
Yeah.
And one of the great studies that was done was they asked people to visualize something for which they felt unconditional love. Often that's a pet. As opposed to, it's hard with your children every day to feel that unconditional love, but in your especially if you're menopausal. But the so imagine stroking an animal. Imagine just for 30 seconds. It just takes 30 seconds. If you're imagining someone or something for which you feel unconditional love, all of your stress hormones change. So they all drop, right? And so those are really, we have an incredible tool in our minds to be able to do that, to be able to switch our chemistry. And every time you do that, you signal to your adrenal glands that you're safe. And if you're safe, then it immediately goes back into long-term survival.
Right. And importantly, like, so not only does your cortisol come back down, but those systems that have been compromised during fight or flight come back to life, so they can start doing the things that they're supposed to be doing. And one of the things that you and I were chatting about in terms of a way to close the stress cycle that's accessible for most of us, and that I think is really underutilized by women, and maybe especially right now during the pandemic, is connection. And the explanation for this is kind of like, when you if you imagine yourself as like a cave person, back in the day when we really were dealing with these like true acute fight or flight stressors that we're designed to deal with. If we chose flight, let's say we were hunting a saber-toothed tiger and decided our brain said, no way can you make this happen, turn around and get back to the cave, and we hightail it back to the cave. When we get back to the cave, our people are there. There's like a support, there's community, there's connection. And that is how we close the stress cycle in that situation. And, so many of the women that I work with, when we really we really kind of start digging into like, what do you need more of? And what do you need less of? The answer to what they need more of is connection. Even though they're surrounded by people all the time, because their lives are so busy and they're in this like go, go, go place, there's not a lot of like meaningful connection happening. And so how do we create meaningful connection? Again, Sarah, you and I've said this before, like, slow the fuck down. Like, just slow your life down and start actually being present with the people who matter. And if they're not around you, pick up the phone, like make that connection happen. Because again, that's the community, that's the connection, that's a signal to your brain, like I'm safe, I'm loved, which is why I love that pet example. I just posted something about the power of petting dogs the other day because there's like research around like petting dogs and animals and how that helps you to relax. Like it really calms, it's very calming for us as humans.
Yeah.
So I guess the point that Sarah and I are really trying to get out here in this podcast is there are so many things that you can do to actually help manage cortisol, help manage this stress response, help keep you out of fight or flight for too long. And they're all really simple things. They don't even take that much time. The problem is we don't prioritize them. So as women, we're not prioritizing these things largely, I think, Sarah, because they fall into the category of self-care, and we're rotten at self-care.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is where I want you to tell your story about self-care in men, because I hear this all the time too. My clients say this to me. They're like, I just can't do it. I don't have time for that. It's selfish. I've got too much stuff on the go. I can't do the things that I need to do. I just don't have time. But then they say something about how their husband, they resent their husband as a result of his ability to do exactly that. So tell your story, because I love it.
Which one do you want? I've got two.
Well, I want the nap story. Let's
the
see.
Nap story. Okay. Okay. So, I find this such an important revelation in my life, actually. And I don't know if it speaks to gender biology or whether it speaks to, or whether it speaks to biology or whether it speaks to learned behavior or a combination of both. But what I noticed when I had two young children was that my husband, on a busy Saturday when he should have been following his list, would just take a nap. I'd find him on the couch taking a nap. Just maybe a 20-minute nap, half an hour nap, or under headphones listening to music, or you name it, out fiddling with the car he's restoring, whatever it was. And it would, I would be incandescent with rage because I was, of course, following my list, managing everybody in the house. I don't know if anybody else experiences this, I'm sure they do, but in households where there's a mom and a dad, the word mom comes out about 400 times more than the word dad comes out, even if dad's standing right there. But so I was living that. And when he would lay down on a Saturday, having worked a full week, mind you, when, lay down on a Saturday to take a few minutes off from his military wife, I would be just filled with rage. But then what I started to notice once I got out of my own way, and once I'd started enough fights about it, I started to notice that after he had a 20-minute nap, he, without prompting, would get up and clean the kitchen or clean the bathroom or do something productive in the house. And that's when I started to realize that he had an innate connection to his own wellness and his own self-care that I override in my own life. So he was feeling tired at 3:00 on a Saturday afternoon, as can be expected from any parent of small children. And he would just take a nap, and he never begrudged me taking a nap. If I wanted to take a nap, I just wouldn't take a nap because I've got too much to do. Yeah. And so I started to take lessons very slowly and reluctantly, mind you. I started to take lessons from watching his behavior. And I'm lucky in that I have a partner who is 100% in. And so I don't have to struggle too much with inequality in the household. But what I noticed was that his pattern of self-care resulted in his improved mental well-being and also his improved energy to tackle all the other things that needed to be done.
Yeah.
And so I just started watching his behavior in general and noticing, and then started to talk to my patients about it, and they also sort of noticed the same thing. And I think that we're we're schooled to sacrifice, right? And I've talked about this on other podcasts about how I think that that's facilitated by the hormones,
Mhm.
but we are schooled to be the ones to be sacrificing, and I think that we can learn a lot from men's behavior if you happen to be in a heterosexual relationship.
Yeah, no, I mean, men take what they need. They're really good at taking what they need, generally speaking. I mean, again,
Absolutely.
generalizing, they are better at taking what they need than we are. And I encourage women to just own it and start taking more of what they need. Because if we took what we needed more, we would not have the rates of burnout and
Wouldn't be
exhaustion.
burnout.
We just
Yeah.
wouldn't, right? I mean, this is the message that Sarah and I are like trying to transmit through the airwaves to everyone listening every time we talk is we have to slow down. We have to start taking what we need. It is not, it's not a sign of weakness. It's not a, it's in fact, I always say to my clients, it's the opposite. It's a sign of strength. Like when you get to
Yeah.
that point, and selfish is not a 4-letter word. Selfish is actually, you know, the definition of selfish is putting yourself first. And if you can't do that sometimes, you are not going to stay well. That's the truth of
Yeah.
it. It's going to catch up with you at some point. Sarah, can you talk about your typical, so we talked about adrenal fatigue in the last podcast, and we're kind of talking about that again now in kind of a different way, but can you talk about like typically what you end up recommending? I mean, I know, again, you can't give any advice on this podcast, but just generally when women come to you, what are the types of things that you recommend?
Well, the first thing we tackle is always sleep. So if sleep is disrupted, either trying to fall asleep is off, waking in the middle of the night, not being able to go back to sleep, or the opposite would be sleeping too long, like feeling like you need to go to bed at 8 o'clock and waking up unrefreshed at 8 o'clock the next morning. So we start to work with sleep first, because if you're not sleeping, then we're not getting anything else done, really. So, I'll talk about taking caffeine out, talk about not eating too late, talk about getting rid of stimulants like chocolate and alcohol, managing blood sugar during the day, and also before bed, doing practices like yoga nidra or guided meditation, um, so that when you do that, you're telling your body that it's safe to go to sleep, right? Because if you're trying to get to sleep, and your body's been in fight or flight all day, what's the signal other than melatonin, because it's dark? What's the signal to tell your body that it's safe to sleep, right? You're not just going to lay down in the middle of the plains when the lion pack is chasing you, right?
Yes.
So your body needs to be able to drop its cortisol at night, as it is designed to do, so that melatonin can kick in and keep you in a deep sleep. So we work on manipulating that situation. We use some herbs to drop cortisol. If necessary, we use techniques like keeping bedrooms dark so that you're supporting melatonin production. No screens a couple of hours before bed. Absolutely no TV in the bedroom. No phones in the bedroom. Those kinds of classic sleep hygiene. And again, like getting rid of that myth that caffeine, if it's out of your system by 3 p.m, is fine. If you're not sleeping, caffeine's not fine. Sorry.
Yeah.
So sleep is the first thing we work on, and then I look at diet. I mean, this isn't necessarily in order of priority after sleep, but we look at diet to make sure blood sugar is being managed, to make sure that there's not too much simple carbohydrate like sugars and white flours and things like that in the diet, that there's a balance of protein and fat and complex carbohydrates. We talk to often women who come into my office adrenally fatigued, are concerned about weight gain. We talk about the fact that we are not going to touch weight gain at the beginning, because if you're adrenally fatigued, then it's going to be setting you up for failure. We need to get your system balanced in terms of its stress hormones before we actually take on weight loss.
Yeah.
And we need to get you sleeping.
Can you talk about that? So I always say to people, like when I'm talking about cortisol, the first thing I say is like, before I tell you all the other things that happen, if your cortisol is too high for too long, let me appeal to your vanity and just tell you this. You are going to have a very difficult time maintaining a healthy weight, and definitely a really challenging time losing weight if your cortisol is still high, because because cortisol is a panic stress hormone, one of the things it does is signal to your body, like, hold on to that carbohydrate. You better store that. We don't know when we're going to get fed next. Like,
Yeah.
we could be basically, building up supplies, because we could be in this for the long haul. And so instead of converting sugar into energy, your body will store it as fat, which means that elevated cortisol makes it easier to gain weight, and it makes it a lot harder to lose weight.
Yeah. So it's it's not a while it's always sort of second after, it's either first and then weight loss and exhaustion, or exhaustion and weight loss. It's just like that weight loss piece isn't going to happen for a while, likely, because we have to get you doing the right amount of exercise for right now, not for doing the Beachbody program on the internet, right? We need to figure out all of these things first. So we talk about diet, we talk about all the possible stressors. We talk about, sometimes I will use herbs and nutrients in order to help a woman get out of so if her body's been in fight or flight for a long period of time, sometimes it just cannot get out on its own, especially if a lot of the stressors are still there. And so sometimes we'll use herbs or supplements to kind of take the top layer of stress down a notch, and to kind of take the edge off of it, so that she can actually work on the tools herself. Because if she's so ramped up that she can't even use the tools that you would give her, for example, or
Right.
I would give her, then we have to calm that down.
Yeah.
So we do that. And then basically, because most of the women I see, the bulk of them are tired but wired. And then, I do have a percentage that are so exhausted that they can't see straight, but the tired but wired people, we have to get their nervous systems to calm down, but then we also have to refuel them, right? So we have to talk about, how we're going to fill up their gas tank, and also the importance of letting that happen slowly, and not like filling it up and draining it, and filling it up and draining it, and filling it up and draining it.
Right.
That's
which again, just goes back to what we've said now 3 times, I think, which is you have to slow down. You can't, it's not when it comes to burnout, it's not a matter of like just taking a quick break and then getting right back at it. Preventing burnout from recurring is also really important, and something that I work with all of my burnout clients on. It's, the end goal is not just to recover from burnout, it's to never have it happen again. And part of never having it happen again is never getting back into that pattern of behavior, because the truth is it'll happen again. And probably, Sarah, you can speak to this, presumably the older we get, especially as we're getting into like perimenopause and menopause, the more likely it is to happen, as our bodies. So you said like you can't once you've not finished, but once you're actively working on this stuff, the trick is really to like not overdo it. And you gave the example of a patient who would be like, okay, I'm good, and I'm training for a half marathon, and your thoughts on that were like bad.
No. So I've treated enough adrenally fatigued patients who, they've usually been feeling shitty for a few years by the time they get to me, or at least a couple of years. And when we really dig down, they've been feeling badly since university. But so when I help them gain even 20% of their energy back, because they're often A types, because that's how they got there in the first place, they're like, oh my God, I feel so much better. I signed up for a marathon, or I've completely Marie Kondoed my house, or, or I'm going to like renovate. I'm taking on this project, or I said yes to this thing at work, or whatever, because that 20% feels so much better than it felt before. Right. But the reality is that 20% is very unstable. So if you imagine you're at 20, and then all of a sudden you have a big weekend of cleaning out all your closets, and then you say to me, well, then I couldn't get out of bed the next day, or I felt anxious all week. That's because you didn't wait until you got to the 100% or the 80%. If we can get you up there, and I say, honestly, this is going to take a year for you to, like, you'll feel better before that. But in terms of stable energy, I want to see you at 80 to 100, so that when you have a stressful time, you only drop to 60. or you only drop to 75. And then with some rest and some restorative activities and good nutrition and good sleep and all that stuff, you can bring yourself back up. But if you're playing around in the 20% zone, not going to happen. So the women, and I've had so many of these women come into my office and say, yeah, I signed up for a half marathon or, you know, a 10K or whatever. I'm just like, no, no, I don't want to discourage exercise, but you are going to feel worse than you felt when you first came here if you take this 20% of energy that I've given you. And well, I didn't give it to you, but you know that your body has finally found, and you start overdoing it again, right? So it's really radical change in behavior is the only way to truly heal from adrenal fatigue. And what I find is that once women get it, once they have to, it's almost like, you know, if we've done an elimination program or a discovery program around food with someone who's sensitive to dairy, let's say it gives them diarrhea, then they're going to have to, they feel great for 8 weeks, and then they're going to have to go out and eat a whole bunch of dairy stuff in order to prove to themselves that actually it does give them diarrhea, right? And so the adrenally fatigued patients have to do that multiple times where they're like, oh yeah, okay, now I get it. Okay. And then finally they come in and they say, okay, now I get it. So so then once they're kind of discharged, if you will, from, I say, well, you know, you're doing great, just stay on these sort of foundational supplements. And if you start to feel like you're going into adrenal fatigue, you know what to do. Right. Yeah. So that's what we're aiming for.
Right. I mean, I think that this is like everything else that you and I support women around for the most part. It's not, there is no quick fix. There's no quick fix for burnout. There's no quick fix for healthy weight loss. There's no quick fix for, you know, a lot of the things that we work with women on. It's about, you know, building a set of steady, reliable habits and, you know, practicing those for enough time that they become like part of how you roll, and building this base, this kind of foundation. We talked about this idea before we recorded this podcast, this idea of like building a healthy foundation for change. So before you take on the big things, you need to make sure that you have a base there of like healthy eating, good sleep, regular joyful movement, some really great stress management strategies, like some of the things we talked about in this session. And then, and only then, should you be thinking about taking on something else that's big. You have to, you know, and that's really your base for resilience too, as a human, just your bounce back factor, like what's going to get you through life without crumbling every time life hands you another big lemon, right? Yeah. But it took you a long time to get burnt out, chances are. You know, it took years for you to get to where you are, so you can't expect to fix it in a month or two. But anyway, I thank you so much, Sarah. I think we have covered off most of the big things we wanted to talk about in this podcast. Every time we do a podcast, we decide on the next podcast because something comes up that we think, oh, we need to talk about that, but we can't fit it into this one. So we have some great ideas for future podcasts. Sarah will continue to be a regular guest on the podcast. And I really appreciate I appreciate so many things about you. I appreciate your sense of humor. I appreciate your expertise. I appreciate the way you so clearly and concisely are able to explain things that oftentimes just feel overwhelming to us as women. So thank you again for your time today. It's been a real pleasure.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Bite Size Balance with your host, Wendy McCallum. As a burnout and balance coach, I help busy high achievers like you create a more balanced, joyful life. To be sure you don't miss any upcoming bite-sized conversations, subscribe now to this podcast. For more balance and wellness tips or to connect with me, visit my website at wendymccallum.com. That's WENDYMCCALLUM.com.